Before America was called America, before borders, before flags, before the idea of race itself, there lived people whose story would later be buried, denied, and erased. They were neither fully African in the eyes of history, nor fully Native American in the eyes of the United States. They were Black Indians, and their existence challenged everything America later tried to define. Long before European ships reached these shores, the land now called the United States was home to hundreds of native nations. Among them were tribes who would later become known as Seminole, Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Yamasee, and Gullah Geechee communities. What history books rarely explain is this: Africans were present in the Americas before mass slavery began. Some arrived through early Spanish expeditions, some escaped from Caribbean colonies. Others came as shipwreck survivors who found refuge among native tribes. Instead of chains, many found acceptance. Native societies did not define people by skin color. They defined people by loyalty, survival, and contribution. Africans married into tribes. They adopted languages, customs, and spiritual beliefs. Their children were not mixed, they were tribal. This was the birth of the Black Indian identity. As European colonization expanded, violence followed. Spanish, British, and later American forces brought slavery, land theft, and genocide. Native tribes were attacked, Africans were hunted, and something powerful happened. They resisted together. Black Indians became warriors, feared, disciplined, and strategic. They knew the land better than the colonizers ever could. Seminole Black Warriors. In Florida, Black Seminoles formed some of the most effective resistance units in American history. They built hidden villages in swamps. They mastered guerrilla warfare. They freed enslaved Africans during raids. To the U.S. Army, they were not just enemies, they were a threat to the entire slave system. Unlike European societies, native tribes did not see Africans as property. Many tribes adopted escaped slaves. Some gave them full tribal citizenship. Others formed autonomous Black Indian towns under tribal protection. This alliance was based on survival, but it became family. Intermarriage was common. Children grew up speaking native languages and African dialects. Spiritual practices merged: drums, chants, ancestor worship, nature rituals. This was not assimilation, it was coexistence. After independence, America needed land. Native tribes stood in the way. Black Indians stood in the way of slavery. So the U.S. government did what it would do best: divide, reclassify, erase. They introduced racial laws: one-drop rule, Negro classification, blood quantum systems. Black Indians were no longer seen as tribal members. They were labeled Black, stripped of native identity. This was not accidental. It was political warfare. Some native leaders, under pressure, were forced into treaties that reduced Black Indians to freedmen, denied them land ownership, removed their voting rights within tribes. Families that had fought together were now separated by law. The message was clear: choose your race or lose everything. Despite betrayal, Black Indians survived. They hid their identity. They passed down oral histories in whispers. They avoided census records. They lived in isolated communities: swamps, forests, marshlands. Places America did not want, but places where freedom could still breathe. By the early 1800s, the stage was set. America wanted expansion. Slavery wanted control. Native tribes were being pushed west, and Black Indians, they were about to face the greatest test of survival in their history: removal, war, erasure. But they would not disappear. America was young. Its hunger was not. The new nation wanted land, power, and control, and anyone who stood in the way would be removed. Native tribes were obstacles. Black Indians were a dangerous example of freedom. So America chose war. Florida was different. Swamps, heat, and disease made it impossible to conquer easily. And hiding inside those swamps was something the U.S. feared deeply: armed Black freedom. The Black Seminoles were not passive refugees. They were organized, trained, and ruthless when defending their people. They had military intelligence, European firearms, African battle tactics, native guerrilla warfare knowledge. They knew the land. The U.S. Army did not. Black Seminoles built fortified villages deep in the Everglades. These were not slave camps. They were free Black republics protected by Seminole warriors. From these villages, they launched raids on plantations, freed enslaved Africans, burned slave records, and disappeared into the swamps. Southern slave owners demanded action. To them, Black Seminoles were proof that enslaved people could fight, organize, and win. That idea terrified America more than Native resistance itself. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. On paper, it promised relocation. In reality, it was ethnic cleansing. 5 so-called civilized tribes were targeted: Seminole, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. But hidden within the act was another goal: separate Black Indians from Native protection. Under pressure, some Native leaders made deals with the U.S. government. These treaties often stated Black Indians were not real tribal members. They would be reclassified as freedmen. They could be sold, surrendered, or relocated separately. Families that had lived together for generations were torn apart. Some Native elites adopted plantation slavery to survive politically. Others resisted and paid with exile or death. This internal division weakened resistance. America exploited it. History textbooks show Native Americans walking west. What they don't show is who was left behind. Black Indians were often excluded from relocation lists, re-enslaved by bounty hunters, kidnapped during forced marches, sold under false racial classification. Many died unnamed. They were erased even while walking beside their own people. The Second Seminole War became the longest and most expensive Indian war in U.S. history. The U.S. Army burned villages, poisoned food supplies, used bloodhounds to track Black Seminoles, captured women and children as leverage. Black Seminole leaders were hunted specifically. Some were executed, some were shipped into Caribbean slavery, others vanished into legend. Yet, resistance continued. When defeat became inevitable, Black Seminoles made a choice. They fled. Some went west with the Seminoles to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, south into Mexico, where slavery was abolished, deeper into Florida's wildest regions. In Mexico, they formed new communities, still armed, still free. America had failed to destroy them. After removal, America rewrote history. Black Indians were reclassified as Negro, removed from tribal roles, erased from census records, excluded from land allotments. The narrative became simple. Indians were Indians, Blacks were Blacks. They were never one people. That lie would shape the next 150 years. Those who remained learned a painful lesson. Visibility meant death or bondage. So they hid ancestry, changed surnames, stopped stopped teaching languages publicly, buried ceremonial objects, passed stories orally in secret. Identity became dangerous. By 1840, the wars were over. But for Black Indians, survival came at a cost. Land lost, families broken, identity erased. Still, they lived, and America was not done with them yet. The war was over. Slavery was abolished. But freedom in America always came with conditions. For Black Indians, the question was no longer survival by force. It was survival by law. And law would prove just as violent as war. After the Civil War, treaties were rewritten. The U.S. government forced Native nations to abolish slavery within tribes, recognize formerly enslaved people as freedmen, grant them certain civil rights. On paper, it sounded fair. In reality, it created a racial caste system inside Native nations. Freedmen were no longer enslaved, but they were no longer fully tribal either. They existed in a legal gray zone. Among the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, Black Indians were now officially labeled freedmen, regardless of blood ties, language, cultural participation, shared history. Their identity was reduced to paperwork, and paperwork would become a weapon. America introduced a new concept, blood quantum. The idea was simple: measure Native identity by fractions, assign racial categories, control land and inheritance. For Black Indians, this was devastating. Even full-blood Native children were classified as Negro, freedmen, non-Indian, based on appearance alone. This was not tribal tradition. This was American racial science. In the late 1800s, the U.S. created the Dawes Rolls. These lists determined who was legally Indian, who received land allotments, who could pass down rights. Agents often decided race by skin tone, hair texture, facial features. Entire Black Indian families were placed on freedmen rolls, even when their grandparents were full tribal members. They spoke native languages. They had never been enslaved. One pen stroke erased centuries of belonging. Land was life. Those listed as freedmen received smaller plots, often infertile land or no land at all. White settlers quickly exploited this: fraud, forced sales, violence, legal manipulation. By 1920, most Black Indians were landless again, not by accident, by design. As Native nations reorganized under U.S. oversight, politics changed. Tribal leadership began to mimic American racial hierarchy, distance themselves from Black identity, and redefine Indian as anti-Black. Why? Because America rewarded it. Federal recognition, funding, sovereignty agreements. Black Indians became inconvenient reminders of shared resistance. Black Indian traditions slowly disappeared from public life. Drumming styles were banned, African-influenced ceremonies discouraged, languages lost speakers. Children were sent to boarding schools where African heritage was punished, Native identity was suppressed, Christianity replaced ancestral belief. A generation grew up disconnected. Still, they endured. Don't misunderstand. Black Indian elders preserved oral histories, maintained burial grounds, secretly practiced ceremonies, married within community to preserve lineage. Survival became invisible. By mid-century, Black Indians had been erased from textbooks, tribal narratives, census identity, American memory. They were told, "You are not Indian enough. You are not Black enough. You do not exist." But they did. In Oklahoma, in Florida, in Texas, in Louisiana, in Mexico, waiting. By 1950, the erasure was nearly complete, not through guns, but through files, laws, and silence. Yet something was changing. Memory was waking up, and the next generation would ask the forbidden question: who were we before America told us who we were?